fourth segment of the fourth lecture in this course. I'm going to talk about economic utilitarianism. We've talked about sensation-based utilitarianism, worried about pains and pleasures, feelings and experiences inside the head. We've talked about preference utilitarian, preference-based, where people tried to satisfy their wants for things in the world, like my want for my cup of tea. That's satisfied by drinking it. There, I just satisfied my desire, my preference for a sip of tea, and I also had a sensation of pleasure, because I like tea. Now we're going to talk about the economic version of preference utilitarianism. Economic utilitarianism is a form of preference utilitarianism where utility is measured by willingness to pay. You remember in the last segment I talked about the von Neumann-Morgenstern way of measuring the intensity of a preference, or the utility somebody would receive when they satisfied that preference, by comparing preference, getting your preference satisfied to a gamble. Right? Now we're going to talk about a different way of measuring it, where you measure how strongly somebody wants something, but in terms of how much they're willing to pay to have that desire satisfied. Or conversely, the cost would be, how much you're willing to accept to give up that preference. So willingness to pay is the maximum amount of money that somebody would be willing to exchange for an economic good or service. And that, in this theory, measures how much preference, how intense the preference of the person is for that good, and that gives a suggestion of how much utility they get by satisfying that preference. Just a couple of notes about willingness to pay. The first thing is that we're talking about marginal willingness to pay. We're not talking about total willingness to pay. We're not talking about how much you're willing to pay for 5 of these, or the average price you would be willing to pay to receive 5 of these things. We're talking about your willingness to pay for the next one additional unit of this good or service. Okay. The other thing is that willingness to pay is not the market price. It's not equal to the market price. What it is the reservation price. It's the price that you would be willing to pay basically in the absence of a defined market. More like what you would be willing to pay in an auction than you're willing to pay in a market where a market price is defined. Once the market price is defined, people are willing to pay only what the market price is, right? So the question loses its force. But supposing the market price is $5, well, there are probably people who would have been who are willing to pay, $6 or $7 to get whatever it is, and there may be other people who don't have $5 and they'd only be willing to pay $2 or $3. Those are their willingnesses to pay, not the market price. It's what economists call the reservation price. So it's a nice theory in the sense it offers a way of measuring utility, and you can add it all up, and you can say, add it up and make the GDP out of it, and say this is, GDP growth is a great thing because everybody is getting more and more ability to pay, and therefore they're able to satisfy the things for which they're willing to pay. The troubles with willingness to pay as a measure of utility are several. Well, there's a list here, more than several. The first and biggest thing is that ability to pay affects willingness to pay. If you have more money, then you're going, even though you want something maybe just as much as somebody who has less money, you're going to be willing to pay more for it because you have more money. Billionaires are going to be willing to pay more for things than paupers. And so it's not that screws up the interpersonal comparison of comparisons with this measure of willingness to pay. Just because if you're willing to pay a lot of money for it, if you have to be also very rich, it doesn't really necessarily mean that you want it as much as somebody who is only willing to pay a smaller price but has a lot less money. So in that sense, it's not a very good measure. It also allows you to buy things that may be immoral, like you can perhaps buy sadistic sex on somewhere, and that is not necessarily a good thing. Right? Just because you can willing to pay for it doesn't mean it's a good preference. You'll also be willing to pay for things about which you do not have enough information. For example, if you buy some, if your uninformed preferences, supposing you've got some pepperoni pizza, and unbeknownst to you, the pepperoni has gone bad. Well, you might still be willing to pay $4 a slice or whatever for this pepperoni pizza, but you would not, if you were properly informed, if you knew that there was something wrong with it, you wouldn't pay that. So in that sense, it doesn't really measure what you really would pay for it if you knew everything that you really should know. Fourth point, I guess, is that since price and willingness to pay are not the same thing, you can measure prices easy enough, but reservation prices are really difficult to measure. For one thing, people don't reveal them. If you're bargaining over something, you do not reveal your bottom line. If you're bargaining over a house or a car or something, you don't tell the salesperson how much you're willing to pay. You keep that secret. The other thing is you may not actually know. I mean, for most things have market prices, and you've probably never thought to yourself, how much would I really be willing to pay for a glass of water if it wasn't available, free or for very low rates in sort of the municipal water system. So even though prices are easy to measure, and it sounds like willingness to pay should be easy to measure because it's in money, the trouble is that because it measures reservation prices, it may be actually quite difficult to measure. Willingness to pay also changes with relative exchange values. There's nothing, written in stone about the value of $5. I'm willing to pay $5 for a cappuccino. Well, maybe, but that's only because there's no substitutes available more cheaply or more expensively, right? If there's different relative prices, if there's substitutes available, whatever, then people's willingness to pay will change. And in different markets, the amount that you might be willing to pay for a beer in the United States and the amount you might be willing to pay for a beer in Mexico, where things relative prices and things are different, they're very, very different. And prices and relative prices all change over time. A good example is computers, like this laptop on which I'm working. My first computer in 1985 cost $5,000, and it had 640 kilobytes of memory, not gigabytes, kilobytes of RAM. And relative to other prices, that seemed a reasonable price at the time, but it's not anymore, right? Things have changed, technology has changed. The laptop I'm working on now, and it costs about $500 or something. And it's many, many times as powerful as what was available then. But I'm paying less for my laptops, more for my tea. It's just the way relative prices change. Willingness to pay changes. It's not again, it's a very relative measure of utility. And finally, there are many things that do not have dollar values. There's no dollar values for your life, your self-ownership. Would you sell yourself into slavery? Maybe even for your honesty. How much would you charge to do something dishonest? Even though you would prefer not to be a slave and you would prefer to be an honest person, it doesn't really make sense, or I hope, that there is no price that you put on these things. So these are some of the weaknesses of willingness to pay as a measure of utility. These willingness to pay contrasts in the pizza example with the informed preference theory of value, which holds that a state of the world is value if it would satisfy a preference that you would have if you were fully informed. People are often mistaken about what they want. And my earlier example was the pizza. If you're not informed that the pepperoni is bad, you might want that slice of pizza. If you are informed the pepperoni is bad, well, you might prefer salad instead. The preference that you would have if you knew everything may be different from your actual preference. So if that's satisfied, you won't get any sort of feeling of satisfaction when it's satisfied. So informed preferences are not the same as the preferences that are talked about by the economic utilitarian. So here's a little question just to help you solidify this. Which of the following best exemplifies the application of economic utilitarian reasoning, as contrasted with preference satisfaction reasoning and sensation-based reasoning. So pause the video, think about it for a second, and I will be right back. Okay, welcome back. Let's have a look here. Economic utilitarian reasoning. Let's start here at the bottom. The decision will cause people to get what they most want. That is an obvious statement, and we've seen it actually before, so, of preference satisfaction utilitarianism. This decision will cause the most joy and the least hurt. Joy, pleasure; hurt, pain. This is sensation-based. If I had known it was defective, then I would not have chosen to buy it. This is an example of informed preference reasoning, right? Not what you did know, and the preference that's important is not your preference to buy it, but your preference that you would have had if you had known everything about it, including that it was defective. So this is not economic utilitarianism. The top one, this decision will maximize GDP. Well, GDP is a measure of total national income, and national income is going to correlate with how much financial means people have, and financial means will correlate with how much they're able to buy of the things they're willing to pay for. So if you could maximize GDP, you would be doing something that an economic utilitarian would approve of. Okay, so see you for the last segment of this lecture in a few minutes.